U.S. President Donald Trump was blindsided by Canada's bold and unexpected move. Shouting from the podium in Congress, Trump made a fiery declaration. "We will annex Greenland to the United States, one way or another." He believed he had shaken the silent power game in the Arctic. But by March 2025, a surprising alliance completely flipped the script. Canada-based Greenland Resources and Amarok Minerals struck a $3 billion deal with the Danish Greenland government and the European Investment Bank. This rare earth and gold megaproject instantly shifted the balance, leaving the U.S. out of the picture. So how did Canada manage to sideline the U.S. and secure one of the Arctic's most critical deals? Back in his November 2024 victory speech, Trump had listed some of his unfinished dreams from his first presidency, mostly headline-grabbing ambitions rather than measurable goals. Among them, building a steel wall on the southern border, securing instant peace in the Russia-Ukraine war, and, shockingly, somehow, adding Greenland to U.S. territory. Soon after returning to the White House, Trump's National Security Council reopened two long-forgotten Cold War documents: the Arctic Gap Identification Protocol from the Eisenhower era and the Thule Radar Belt Modernization Draft from the 1980s. Both focused on gaining some form of ownership or long-term control over Greenland, previously framed as lease agreements with Denmark. But on March 4, 2025, in a defiant address to Congress, Trump escalated the ambition. "We will get it one way or another." This was no longer about leasing, it was about full control. Pete Hegseth, the newly appointed Secretary of Defense, argued that Greenland's north coast creates a critical radar blind spot, leaving U.S. missile defenses exposed to Russian submarines sneaking through the Arctic undetected. At the same time, open-source analysts pointed to another motive: minerals. For years, geological surveys predicted that Greenland held 38 billion tons of rare earth elements, rich deposits of graphite, zirconium, niobium, and an estimated 17 billion barrels of Arctic oil. Despite security concerns, Trump's team pushed the economic angle hardest, pitching the acquisition to the Senate as a matter of economic national security. The loudest voice backing Trump's Greenland push came from Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, who warned, "If we don't mine these resources, Beijing will." At first, Copenhagen's response was subdued. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen kept it simple, telling reporters Greenland belongs to the Greenlanders. But soon, Greenland's leadership stepped in with decisive clarity. On March 12, 2025, Greenland's coalition government in Nuuk, alongside the Danish royal family, issued a powerful joint statement. They made it clear the sovereignty of Greenland was not up for negotiation. The sharpest warning was aimed directly to Washington. Any attempt to force the issue would undermine the North Atlantic Alliance itself. The message to NATO was unmistakable. If one ally pressures another over territorial claims, the very foundation of the alliance comes to question. Back home, Trump's repeated promises to make Greenland rich resonated with many Americans, who argued the U.S. already protects it, why not just buy it? But Greenland had other plans. For years, Nuuk had been looking toward Europe, not America, to chart its future. The EU's Critical Raw Materials Act, passed in 2023, required that at least 25% of rare earth materials consumed within Europe must come from allied sources and sustainable mining projects that meet strict environmental and human rights standards. For Greenland's left-leaning red-green coalition government, this was the perfect opportunity. They aimed to use Europe's resource demands as leverage, to push back against Trump's pressure, preserve Greenland's ties with Denmark, and develop their mining sector through sustainable, revenue-sharing partnerships with Europe. It was an ambitious strategy, but they needed serious capital to make it work. That's when two Canadian companies stepped into the spotlight. One of them, Greenland Resources, Inc., was hardly a corporate giant. It was a mid-sized mining venture that had spent years quietly prospecting for molybdenum in Ontario back in the early 2010s. In North America, the company struggled to attract investment. Its stock was thinly traded, and it flew under the radar. But things changed when European steelmakers ramped up their demand for molybdenum. Greenland Resources signed a letter of intent with the European investment bank's Green Fund in late 2024. When Danish Export Credit Agency, IFO, agreed to back the deal with collateral, the project suddenly gained serious momentum. That's when the 30-year Momberg mining license came up for approval and Canada was officially in the game. When Greenland's cabinet officially approved the mining project in March 2025, Washington was hit with a reality it hadn't expected. Instead of raising the U.S. flag on Greenland, it would be Canadian companies backed by European financing that would mine the island's resources, and the minerals were headed straight for Europe's high-value steel industry. The second major player, Amarok Minerals, was a multi-metal exploration company with operations spread across Toronto, Reykjavik, and London. While there had been some small-scale gold mining at Greenland's Nalunaq deposit back in the early 2000s, poor infrastructure, harsh conditions, and a lack of investment had stalled progress.
But now, Amarok's new funding round closed with astonishing speed, driven by a surge of interest from British pension funds and speculators in London's financial district. The Arctic gold narrative captured imaginations, and the company's shares on the SEDEX AIM exchange reflected that hype. The investment trail was fascinating. Out of £45 million raised, £9 million came from Denmark's public investment fund, IFO. Another £6 million came from a subsidiary of Norway's government pension fund. The rest flowed in from private equity groups based in the UK and the US. Ironically, while US policymakers were plotting to seize Greenland, American financial capital was already quietly invested in Canada's Arctic gold venture. The Toronto Press published a striking map under the headline "Canada's Arctic Hexagon." The map outlined a mega-development corridor stretching from iron ore mines on Baffin Island, surrounding Ellesmere Island with mobile rocket tracking stations, linking to the NASA-CSA Joint Space Runway on Devon Island and extending to Greenland. For 2 decades, this Arctic belt had been cold and politically distant, but under Trump, the map suddenly warmed. Canada's government saw some strategic value in the increased U.S. military presence in the region, but the idea of Greenland's de facto annexation was a red flag. Ottawa worried that this could open the door to future territorial claims over the Canadian Arctic islands. That's why both Ottawa and Brussels moved quickly to soften tensions by building direct economic partnerships with Greenland. Even NATO allies were now split. At the Vilnius summit, the U.S. hardline position disrupted Arctic defense talks. Norway firmly backed Denmark. Poland stayed silent, unwilling to risk its tight defense ties with Trump's White House. Canada issued a diplomatic warning to Washington. There's a difference between resource partnerships among allies and aggressive moves that could fracture the alliance. French President Emmanuel Macron actively supported Greenland's independence by mobilizing French development banks to fund a new airport on the island. France's defense ministry also stepped up patrols in the North Atlantic, even sending the nuclear submarine Suffren to Baffin Bay under the label of an observation mission. Within this complex geopolitical chessboard, the biggest shock came on the American battery supply chain. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, U.S. EV tax breaks were tied to domestic battery production, but Washington hadn't factored Greenland into its supply map. While molybdenum isn't a core battery metal, it's critical for high-strength steel, heat-dissipating components, nuclear reactor linings, and hypersonic missile tips. Previously, molybdenum was on the U.S. critical minerals list but was classified as medium risk. Now, with Greenland's supply funnel funneling toward Europe, that risk category suddenly spiked. The result? The defense suppliers linked to the Pentagon came under immense pressure. The race for Arctic resources had become not just an economic scramble, but a direct challenge to America's strategic priorities. Lockheed Martin recently announced it might delay its hypersonic weapons testing from 2026 to 2030, while Raytheon revealed plans to seek alternative mineral supplies from Australia and Chile. Meanwhile, the rising influence of Canadian companies in Greenland has stirred unease even within the U.S. Congress. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska warned, "Hot conflict in the Arctic risks environmental damage, alienates European allies, and puts Canada at odds with us." Meanwhile, Democratic senators from Maine and Vermont argued that rising NATO tensions would only strengthen Canada-EU cooperation, urging a consensus-based mining partnership to avoid conflict. In response, the U.S. State Department proposed a comprehensive development initiative with Denmark and Greenland's local government, but Copenhagen rejected the plan, especially when it tied economic aid to granting the U.S. Navy expanded base rights. Canada's strategy was twofold. 1. Closing Europe's resource supply gap by leveraging Canadian investment, and 2. Pursuing an Arctic buffer approach to keep Greenland out of unilateral U.S. control. Ottawa's security reports warned that if Greenland fell under U.S. de facto control, disputes over the Northwest Passage would intensify, and China would leverage this to challenge U.S. claims under the Global Commons Doctrine. So Canada's solution was elegant and economic: transform Greenland into a hub of multilateral interests via integration. The Canadian Ministry of Finance, the European Investment Bank, and Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund launched the $3.1 billion Arctic Green Transition Fund, aimed at financing infrastructure in Greenland. Importantly, with no U.S. institutions involved in its management. Meanwhile, the geological race heated up. Amarok's Nalunaq gold site might seem modest, but is packed with arsenopyrite gold, silver, and copper byproducts. These metals are critical for high-conductivity alloys, essential to clean energy transmission. According to the EU's Blue Hydrogen Initiative, such alloys will be vital for valve and turbine manufacturing after 2030, making Europe's investment in Amarok through IFO a strategic move, unlocking access to a valuable copper-silver industrial chain.
Greenland further solidified its political sovereignty with the passage of the Infrastructure Forlig Bill in July 2025. The law raises the minimum local employment rate in mining projects from 50% to 70% and requires that at least 10% of profits be directed to Greenland's future fund in Nuuk. Canadian firms accepted these terms, viewing the fund, which draws inspiration from New Zealand's Maori model, as a stabilizing force that lowers investment risks over the long term. Whether U.S. companies would agree to such revenue sharing remained unclear. Thus, Nuuk reaffirmed its preference to stay aligned with the Canada-Europe Consortium. From an international law standpoint, any U.S. military intervention in Greenland would be complicated. Denmark is a NATO member, meaning an attack could trigger Article 5 collective defense. While Trump's rhetoric remains fiery, Pentagon plans appear focused on limited force demonstrations rather than full-scale occupation. Examples include Lockheed C-130s landing at Thule Air Base for symbolic flag demonstrations and Vertex requests for access to missile-tracking satellite antennas, moves signaling a push for de facto access, not outright control. However, the growing U.S. military footprint is stirring tensions in Copenhagen, fueling fears that an American presence might spark a stronger independence movement among Greenlanders. Investment fever is blazing amid the geopolitical tensions. Canadian company Cedar Energy is negotiating with European partners to build a floating LNG conversion plant off Disco Bay, signaling a bold new chapter in Arctic energy. Meanwhile, the U.S. struggles to calm European buyers, as the Trump administration's uncertainty over LNG export permits has shaken confidence. Gas flowing through the Canada-Greenland corridor is forging a new route to Eurasia, bypassing Washington altogether. This shift is reshaping energy strategies across Central Europe. For Germany, it offers a chance to diversify away from U.S. LNG dependence after severing ties with Russian gas by embracing Canadian Arctic LNG. Zooming out, Trump's obsession with Greenland has spectacularly backfired. Instead of becoming an American territory, the island has transformed into an Arctic innovation hub, jointly led by Canada and Europe. This dynamic hints at a weakening of Washington's transatlantic alliance with the EU. Canada, meanwhile, is playing the middle power role masterfully, balancing its battery export bans with strategic moves in Greenland's mining sector, navigating between the major global powers. Though the White House still entertains the possibility of forceful acquisition, the costs, military, political, and economic, are skyrocketing with every new Canada-EU partnership. In summary, the Arctic is no longer just a frozen expanse. It's a high-stakes chessboard where international law, trade routes, energy security, and indigenous sovereignty all hang in the balance. While the Trump administration plays the game with brute force, middle powers like Canada are gaining ground through multiple alliances, indigenous partnerships, and innovative revenue-sharing models. Greenland has outgrown the outdated cliché of an island for sale. Today, it is the Pandora's box of critical minerals for the 21st century, and the keys lie not in Washington, but in Ottawa and Brussels. What's your take on this Arctic power play? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. To stay ahead on this story and others, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. Thanks for watching.